I didn't expect to find the ghost of my past sitting in the investor's chair, Mateo.
Black ink bled across the polished mahogany table like a sudden violent omen the moment the heavy Mont Blanc pen shattered under the crushing grip of the CEO's hand. Do not stop the presentation on my account, Ms. Vargas. I am acutely interested in hearing how a ghost intends to sell me a memory, Mateo Sterling said, his voice a low, lethal baritone that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the 40th floor boardroom of Sterling Media. Elena Vargas stood paralyzed on the podium, the laser pointer slipping from her sweaty palms as her eyes locked onto the man sitting at the head of the table. The very man who had vanished without a trace into the warm, sun-drenched streets of Madrid exactly 5 years ago. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed Wall Street ruthlessness, yet his jade-green eyes burned with the same dangerous, possessive intensity that used to strip her bare in a cramped Spanish studio apartment. Her heart slammed against her ribs in a frantic, terrifying rhythm, screaming at her to flee from the room, but the sheer weight of his gaze pinned her feet to the plush carpet. "I am waiting, Elena," he murmured, leaning forward so the overhead lights caught a faint, jagged scar near his temple that had never been there before. Swallowing the thick lump of panic lodged in her throat, Elena forced her chin up, refusing to let the aristocratic vultures of the Sterling board see the devastating tremor in her knees. "The Echoes Initiative is not a memory, Mr. Sterling. It is a revolutionary digital architecture designed to preserve independent artistic integrity in an increasingly monopolized market," she countered, her voice ringing out with a cold, professional defiance that masked the catastrophic bleeding of her internal wounds. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a complex web of structural designs that subtly echoed the intertwined balconies and hidden courtyards of European architecture. A deeply personal aesthetic they had once mapped out together on a cheap napkin over cheap sangria. Every time she breathed, the faint, suffocating scent of his signature woodsy cologne drifted across the massive room, a cruel phantom dragging her back to the nights she spent crying on a cold tile floor, waiting for a lover who had abandoned her. The board members shifted restlessly in their leather chairs, exchanging skeptical glances at the indie creator who dared to stand so tall in their corporate temple, completely oblivious to the silent, electrifying war waging between the independent director and the billionaire heir. This is a charity project masquerading as a tech venture, and Sterling Media does not fund nostalgic fairy tales for starving artists. Richard Hayes, an older board member with a sneer carved into his wrinkled face, interrupted harshly while tossing her meticulously crafted dossier onto the table. "You are asking for a $50 million injection while demanding full creative autonomy, which is not only naive, but borderline insulting to the seasoned investors in this room." Elena's jaw clenched, her fierce pride flaring up as she prepared to tear Richard's outdated corporate philosophy apart with raw data. But a sudden sharp sound echoed through the room. Mateo had slowly tapped his knuckles against the mahogany surface, a simple rhythmic gesture that instantly commanded absolute terrified silence from Richard and the rest of the board. "The architecture is flawed, yes, but not because it lacks commercial viability, Richard. It is flawed because the creator is clearly terrified of surrendering control to someone who actually knows how to protect it," Mateo stated, his gaze never leaving Elena's pale face, dissecting her soul with surgical precision. "You built a beautiful fortress, Ms. Vargas, but you left the front door wide open for thieves. which tells me you have spent the last 5 years running from shadows instead of building a proper empire. The audacity of his words, layered with a venomous double meaning that accused her of cowardice, ignited a blinding, white-hot fury deep within Elena's chest, temporarily overriding the agonizing heartbreak. My fortress is perfectly secure, Mr. Sterling, and I assure you that my only mistake was assuming this board had the visionary capacity to recognize innovation without needing to chain it to a corporate desk. She fired back, her dark eyes blazing with an unyielding fire as she stared down the man who had effortlessly broken her heart. Mateo slowly stood up, towering over the room like a dark, immovable monolith. His physical presence so overwhelmingly dominant that several executives instinctively shrank back in their seats. Sterling Media will fully fund the Echoes project to the exact amount of $50 million, effectively immediately, he announced, his voice devoid of any inflection, dropping a bomb that left Richard sputtering in red-faced outrage. However, the capital comes with a non-negotiable caveat. The project will not be managed by the General Board. It will be placed under my direct, exclusive supervision. And you, Ms. Vargas, will report solely to me, moving your operations into my personal executive suite. A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom as the sheer, unprecedented nature of the CEO's demand registered. Mateo Sterling was notoriously reclusive, a man who delegated everything and never personally managed a single acquisition, let alone shared his private floor with an independent contractor. That is completely out of the question, as my independence is the fundamental core of this initiative. I will not sign over my autonomy to become a micromanaged puppet in your personal collection. Elena rejected instantly, her voice trembling not from fear, but from the suffocating realization that he was trying to trap her in a gilded cage. Richard slammed his hand on the table, sensing an opportunity to regain control. You are out of line, young woman, and you should be crawling on your knees in gratitude for this absurdly generous offer. Security will escort you out before you embarrass yourself further. Before the guards standing by the door could even twitch a muscle, Mateo's voice cracked like a vicious whip. If anyone lays a single finger on her, they will be clearing out their desks before the elevator reaches the lobby. Mateo warned, his jade eyes darkening with a terrifying absolute possessiveness that made the blood run cold in Richard's veins. The meeting is adjourned. Everyone get out and leave the contracts on the table, Mateo commanded, dismissing the most powerful executives in New York as if they were mere interns. His gaze locked onto Elena like a predator cornering a desperate prey. Within seconds, the grand boardroom emptied out, the heavy double doors clicking shut to seal Elena inside a terrifying vacuum of silence with the ghost of her past. He walked slowly around the massive table, the methodical thud of his expensive leather shoes echoing against the glass walls, narrowing the distance between them until she could see the faint, erratic pulse beating at the base of his throat. 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days, Elena, he whispered, his voice suddenly shedding the cold corporate armor, revealing a raw, jagged desperation that sounded almost like a physical wound. I spent a fortune tearing this earth apart looking for you, hunting down every rumor, every whisper, only for you to walk into my boardroom demanding my money, while looking at me as if I am the villain in your tragic story. You don't get to play the victim here, Mateo. Not after you vanished from that apartment in Madrid, without a single word, leaving me to piece together my shattered life, while you return to your ivory tower to inherit an empire," she yelled, the carefully maintained dam of her professionalism finally bursting, releasing years of toxic, festering grief. She stepped back, her body hitting the edge of the presentation podium, utterly trapped by his looming, broad-shouldered frame that completely blocked any route of escape. Mateo closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched near the faded scar on his temple, as if her accusation had physically struck him. "You know absolutely nothing about what happened in Madrid, about the blood on the streets, or the hell I woke up to. And I will not let you walk out that door and disappear into the wind again," he growled, slamming his hands down on the podium on either side of her, caging her in with a terrifying, absolute finality. "You are going to sign this exclusivity contract right now, or I will use every ounce of power I possess to ensure that no bank, no venture capitalist, and no independent firm in the Western Hemisphere ever looks at your project." The ruthless, calculated threat hung in the sterile air of the boardroom, a brutal testament to the fact that the passionate, artistic boy she had loved in Spain had been entirely consumed by the ruthless billionaire standing before her. Elena looked into his eyes, searching for a trace of bluff, but found only a bottomless, obsessive determination that promised absolute ruin if she dared to defy him. "You are a monster, Mateo. You are using the only thing I care about to blackmail me into submission because you are too cowardly to accept that you lost me," she whispered, her voice laced with venom and a profound, agonizing heartbreak. Mateo picked up a fresh pen from the table and pressed it forcefully into her trembling hand, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a treacherous, burning shockwave straight to her core. "I am whatever you need me to be, Elena, but I am not losing you twice. Sign the damn paper and step into my cage, or watch your life's work burn to ashes," he countered, his breath brushing against her cheek in a deadly, intimate promise. Trembling with a mixture of pure hatred and a dark, undeniable gravitational pull, Elena pressed the pen to the paper, signing her name and effectively surrendering her freedom to the very man who had already destroyed her once. The next morning, the sprawling executive suite of Sterling Media felt less like a workspace and more like a high-tech fortress designed to isolate Elena from the rest of the world. She sat at a sleek, minimalist desk constructed of obsidian-tinted glass, her laptop open to the Echo's project files, but her eyes were fixed on the panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline that seemed to mock her with its vastness. The door to the private office opened without a knock, and the subtle, rhythmic sound of Mateo's footsteps and the polished floor caused a familiar, involuntary spike of adrenaline to surge through her veins. He didn't say a word, simply walking over to the coffee station he had installed just for her. A gesture that felt like a patronizing gift, and set a steaming ceramic mug down on the edge of her desk. "Black 2 sugars, exactly how you drank it during the long nights in Madrid," he remarked, his voice devoid of any warmth as he settled into the leather chair opposite her, his intense jade eyes immediately beginning to scan her work, as if he were auditing a criminal record rather than an artistic endeavor. "I didn't ask for you to remember my preferences, Mateo, just as I didn't ask to be displaced from my own studio to serve as a glorified trophy in your penthouse office," Elena retorted, her fingers tight around the handle of the mug, her voice icy enough to fracture the thick, oppressive tension filling the room. Mateo's focus snapped up from the screen, his gaze darkening with a flash of raw, unfiltered irritation that made the air feel suddenly thin and electrified. Your studio was a fire hazard in a crumbling district, and I have moved you here because I require absolute oversight of every byte of data that enters this project. Not because I have any interest in playing romantic games from our past, he countered, his voice dripping with a calculated professional disdain that felt like a deliberate insult. He stood up and began pacing behind her desk, his imposing shadow constantly falling over her workspace, a subtle psychological reminder of who held the leash in this new, suffocating arrangement. If you want to keep your autonomy, stop acting like a petulant intern and start treating this as a high-stakes corporate acquisition, because the investors are already breathing down my neck about the $50 million I dumped into your visionary dream. The harsh reality of his words hit her with the weight of a physical blow, reminding her that the delicate bridge they were attempting to cross was built over a chasm of deep, festering resentment. Elena turned her chair to face him, forcing herself to meet his piercing, predatory gaze with a cold, unyielding steadiness that required every ounce of her willpower. I have never been a puppet, Mateo, and if you think that throwing money at me gives you the right to dissect my professional competence, while ignoring the fact that you effectively blackmailed me into this cage, you are gravely mistaken, she stated, her voice steady despite the treacherous, thundering heart that insisted on betrayed her every time he came within an inch of her space. Mateo leaned over the desk, bracing his hands on the glass surface and forcing her to retreat until she was pressed hard against the back of her chair, his face mere centimeters from hers, his eyes searching her features as if he were looking for a lie. I am not blackmailer. I am a protector who is tired of watching you burn your life down just to prove a point about your own self-reliance, he growled, the scent of his cologne overwhelming her senses, an intoxicating, dangerous, and utterly familiar trap that she was desperate to escape. You don't get to call yourself my protector when you were the architect of the trauma that drove me to build these walls in the first place. And your obsession with control is just a pathetic symptom of your own cowardice. Elena whispered the accusation, hanging in the air like a poisoned dagger that finally seemed to pierce through his steely facade. Mateo's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine, agonizing vulnerability crossing his face, before he slammed the iron mask of the billionaire heir back into place, his hands clenching into fists on the glass until his knuckles turned white. We are here to finish the Echoes project, and I suggest you get back to the final renderings before I decide that your presence in this office is a liability that I can no longer afford to manage, he snapped, turning on his heel and retreating to the far corner of the office, his back a rigid, impenetrable wall of ice. Elena let out a long, shuddering breath, turning back to the screen with trembling fingers, her mind a chaotic storm of memories that threatened to shatter her carefully crafted professional facade. By late afternoon, the suffocating atmosphere had reached a breaking point, and the constant, silent scrutiny from the corner of the office was making it impossible for Elena to concentrate on the complex architectural software. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her bag and ignoring the sudden, piercing look of alarm that flickered across Mateo's face as he looked up from his own work, his hand reaching reflexively for his phone. I am going to the archives to check the physical structural reports, and don't even think about sending a security detail to follow me like a common prisoner, she warned, her voice thick with a mixture of defiance and a desperate, suffocating need for a moment of genuine freedom. Mateo's posture softened just a fraction, a brief, fleeting moment of hesitation softening the lethal jade of his eyes, as if he wanted to reach out and pull her back. But the old, arrogant habits of the Sterling heir won out. The archives are in the basement, and I suggest you keep your phone on because I am not losing you in this building because of your stubborn, irrational need to play the martyr," he countered, his voice returning to that low, authoritative rumble that felt like a velvet trap. Descending into the bowels of the Sterling Tower was like stepping out of the bright, manicured world above and into the dark, forgotten history of a dynasty that had been built on secrets and ruthless expansion. The archive room was a sprawling labyrinth of floor-to-ceiling metal shelves packed with dusty, yellowing ledgers and digital drives that held the skeletons of every deal the Sterling Empire had ever engineered. As she navigated the narrow aisles, her mind kept drifting back to the strange, jagged scar on Mateo's temple, a detail she had noticed during the boardroom confrontation, a detail that defied the narrative she had constructed about him, living a charmed, untouched life in New York. She pulled a file labeled 1998 to 2005 Acquisitions. Her curiosity piqued by a recurring name that kept appearing in the margins. Richard Hayes, the man who had been so eager to see her removed from the boardroom. The documents were a cryptic mess of shell companies and offshore accounts, but the recurring signature of the Sterling patriarch suggested a long history of aggressive, potentially illegal, hostile takeovers. A revelation that began to paint a very different picture of the ivory tower Mateo lived in. Lost Miss Vargas? Or just looking for something to justify your prejudice? A voice purred from the shadows, making Elena jump and drop the file, the papers scattering across the cold concrete floor. Richard Hayes stepped out from behind a row of filing cabinets, his face twisted into a smirk that was as polished and dangerous as a serrated knife. He didn't look like a subordinate. He looked like a man who owned the very ground Elena was standing on, his eyes glittering with a predatory, calculated malice that sent a shiver down her spine. "I was just conducting a routine review of the project's historical data, which is well within my purview as the director, even if it seems to make you uncomfortable, Mr. Hayes," Elena said, scrambling to gather the papers, her heart thumping against her ribs in a frantic, warning rhythm. Richard walked over his heel, coming down squarely on the edge of the documents she was trying to retrieve. His expression, one of bored, cruel superiority that made her blood run cold. "You are not a director here. You are a temporary, high-priced experiment that Mateo has brought home like a stray dog. And you should be careful what you dig up in these files, as some stones are better left unturned, if you care about your future." Is that a threat, or are you just trying to project your own insecurity about my project, because you know that Mateo will never again give you the power to influence his decisions? Elena asked, her voice steady and sharp, her hand tightening around the edges of the file, as she met his gaze with a lethal, unflinching confidence. Richard leaned down, his face dangerously close to hers, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried the weight of 1,000 silent, dark corporate coups. "Mateo doesn't know who you are, what you were doing in Madrid, or the fact that you were just a common, desperate artist, playing him for a fool while he was intoxicated by his own pathetic, youthful infatuation. I know exactly what you are, and if you think for 1 second that you can climb into his bed and manipulate the Sterling legacy, you have no idea how deep this grave will be when I'm finished with you." He stepped back, his smirk widening as he turned and sauntered away into the darkness of the archive, leaving Elena standing amidst the scattered papers, her mind reeling with a terrifying, paralyzing realization. The threat wasn't just about her project. It was about the dark, violent history that she had been shielded from for 5 years. A history that Mateo was clearly still a prisoner of, and one that she had now inadvertently stumbled into the heart of. The annual Sterling Media Gala was a dazzling, suffocating spectacle of crystal chandeliers, predatory smiles, and free-flowing champagne that tasted distinctly like corporate warfare. Elena Vargas stood near a towering ice sculpture, her simple, elegant emerald gown feeling like a suit of armor that was rapidly rusting under the collective, scrutinizing glares of New York's elite. Across the cavernous ballroom, surrounded by a sycophantic crowd of investors and socialites, Mateo Sterling held court, looking devastatingly lethal, in a custom midnight blue tuxedo that amplified his commanding, unapproachable aura. He was nodding politely to a senator, but his jade green eyes repeatedly cut through the crowd, tracking her every movement with a dark, obsessive possessiveness that made her skin burn, even from 100 feet away. "You look like you're plotting a murder, or perhaps an escape, Ms. Vargas," a slick, familiar voice murmured right beside her ear, snapping her attention away from the magnetic pull of the billionaire. Richard Hayes materialized from the crowd, holding a crystal flute, his face twisted into a condescending smile that instantly triggered the fight-or-flight instincts she had been suppressing all evening. "Neither, Mr. Hayes. I am simply marveling at how much expensive champagne it takes to drown out the sheer lack of original ideas in this room," she fired back smoothly, her voice a cool, detached murmur. Richard chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that rattled like loose coins in a tin cup as he stepped closer to invade her personal space with calculated malice. "You have a sharp tongue, I'll give you that, but let's not pretend you are here because of your undeniable groundbreaking talent," he sneered, swirling the golden liquid in his glass with a lazy, arrogant flick of his wrist. "We all know about Madrid, Elena, and we all know exactly what kind of desperate, starving artist latches onto a wealthy heir to fund her pathetic, oversized dreams." The blatant, disgusting insult hit her like a physical blow, a sudden, blinding flash of humiliation that threatened to buckle her knees right there on the polished marble floor. "You know absolutely nothing about my past or my talent. And if you think you can intimidate me with cheap, fabricated gossip, you are severely overestimating your own relevance," Elena whispered furiously, her hands clenching into tight fists at her sides as she fought back the stinging tears of outraged pride. "Oh, but I know exactly what your price was in Spain, sweetheart. And I assure you, Mateo's father made sure every cent was accounted for before we dragged him back to civilization," Richard countered, delivering the poisonous revelation with a sickeningly sweet smile that made the blood freeze in her veins. The sheer, nauseating weight of Richard's words, implying that she was nothing but a paid-off mistake from Mateo's past, shattered the last fragile remnants of Elena's composure, compelling her to turn and flee toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. She pushed blindly through the sea of silk and diamonds, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the suffocating walls of the grand ballroom seemed to close in around her fiercely independent spirit. Before her trembling hand could even graze the brass handle of the door, a steely, unyielding grip clamped around her wrist, halting her frantic escape with a sudden, jarring halt. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Mateo demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the chaotic noise of the gala, his tall frame instantly blocking her path to freedom. "Let me go right now, Mateo, before I cause a scene that will embarrass your precious company and humiliate your arrogant, elitist friends," she choked out, desperately trying to wrench her arm free from his iron hold. But he only tightened his grip, his eyes darkening to a stormy, terrifying shade of jade. "You are not running away from me again, Elena. Not tonight, not ever," he growled, entirely ignoring the shocked whispers of nearby guests, as he practically dragged her through a side door and down a dimly lit, deserted corridor. He shoved her gently but firmly into a secluded, shadowed alcove, away from the prying eyes of the gala, trapping her against the cold silk wallpaper with his broad, imposing shoulders. The silence in the narrow hallway was deafening, broken only by the frantic, synchronized rhythm of their ragged breathing, as the intoxicating, woodsy scent of his cologne completely enveloped her senses. "Why are you running? Was Richard reminding you that you don't belong in this world? Or were you just looking for another excuse to abandon ship the moment things got complicated?" Mateo accused, his voice thick with a raw, bleeding bitterness that completely shattered his icy CEO facade, exposing the traumatized, heartbroken man beneath. "You arrogant, narcissistic bastard. Your own board member just implied I was a paid whore from your sordid past in Madrid, and you have the audacity to accuse me of running?" Elena screamed, shoving her hands hard against his solid chest in a futile attempt to push him away, her dark eyes blazing with unchecked fury and devastating pain. Mateo froze, the accusation hitting him with the force of a physical gunshot, his jaw clenching so hard that the faint, jagged scar on his temple stood out starkly against his pale skin. "Richard said what?" Mateo whispered, the lethal, freezing calm returning to his voice, a dangerous indicator of the violent storm brewing just beneath the surface of his tailored tuxedo. "He said your father knew my price, Mateo. He said they bought me off, which explains perfectly why you vanished without a trace and never bothered to look back." She cried out the tears she had fought so hard to suppress, finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot, miserable paths down her cheeks. "Do you honestly believe I would ever let them touch you, let alone pay you off to leave me?" he rasped, stepping so close that his chest brushed against hers, his eyes searching her face with a frantic, desperate intensity that made her breath hitch in her throat. "I spent 5 years living in an absolute, suffocating hell, convinced that you had moved on, and today I have to watch you smile at every corporate vulture in that room, while you look at me like I am a monster." He reached out his trembling fingers, gently wiping a tear from her cheek, the touch so painfully tender that it felt like a cruel juxtaposition to his dominating presence. "You are a monster, Mateo, because you trapped me here. You suffocate me with your control, and you make me feel things I spent 5 years trying to burn out of my soul," she confessed in a ragged whisper, her gaze locked onto his lips, the magnetic, destructive pull between them finally reaching a critical, catastrophic mass. "Then let it burn, Elena," he groaned, a dark, primal sound of total surrender before his hands tangled violently in her dark hair, pulling her face up as his mouth crashed down onto hers. The kiss was not a gentle, romantic reunion. It was an explosion of 5 years of starvation, a brutal, desperate collision of anger, grief, and undeniable, ruinous passion that instantly obliterated the rest of the world. Elena gasped against his mouth, but instead of pushing him away, her arms wrapped fiercely around his neck, her fingers digging into his broad shoulders as she kissed him back with a ravenous, matching intensity. He pressed her harder against the wall, his tongue parting her lips to taste the sweet, familiar fire that had haunted his dreams, his hands roaming down her back with a frantic, possessive hunger that declared she was his and his alone. When they finally broke apart, the air in the narrow alcove was thick, heavy, and scorched with the aftermath of their explosive collision, their foreheads resting against each other as they fought for oxygen. Mateo's chest heaved, his eyes closed tightly, as if he were trying to memorize the exact sensation of holding her. His thumbs gently, unconsciously stroking the pulse point at the base of her neck. This doesn't change anything, Mateo. A kiss doesn't erase 5 years of silence, and it certainly doesn't fix the fact that your company is a den of snakes trying to destroy my life's work. Elena whispered, her voice trembling violently as she forced herself to take a step back, the loss of his body heat leaving her feeling suddenly cold and profoundly vulnerable. He opened his eyes, the jade depths swirling with a complex, tortured mix of adoration and deep-seated terror, refusing to let her completely slip away from his grasp. It changes everything, because it proves that you are still mine, Elena, whether you want to admit it to yourself or not, he stated, his voice a low, unyielding vow that sent a shiver straight down her spine. I will deal with Richard Hayes and his pathetic attempts to intimidate you, and I promise you that no one in that ballroom or this entire city will ever dare to disrespect you again. Mateo swore, his tone laced with a chilling, ruthless finality that reminded her just how dangerous the man she loved had truly become. I don't need a knight in a bespoke suit to fight my battles, Mateo. I need an honest partner who doesn't keep me locked in a glass cage to protect his own fragile ego, she countered, lifting her chin with a fierce, unwavering pride that absolutely captivated him, despite the sting of her accurate accusation. He looked at her, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the truth of her words, recognizing the insurmountable wall of mistrust that still stood tall between them. I am not keeping you in a cage to protect my ego, Elena. I am keeping you close because I am terrified that the moment I look away, the world will steal you from me again, he admitted softly, stepping back to give her space, a painful, agonizing concession to her independence. Go home, lock your doors, and prepare yourself, because tomorrow I am going to tear this board apart to secure your project, and I will need you to trust me. The atmosphere inside the Sterling Media boardroom the following morning was so thick with malice it felt almost palpable, a stifling fog of corporate greed and hidden agendas. Mateo sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his posture deceptively relaxed, though the sharp predatory gleam in his eyes suggested he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Richard Hayes occupied the seat to his right, his smug, practiced confidence barely masking a subtle tremor of nervousness as he anticipated the final board vote to strip Elena of her project. Elena entered the room with her head held high, her professional attire a sharp contrast to the trembling, heartbroken woman she had been in the gallows alcove. She had spent the entire night meticulously cross-referencing every single document Richard had attempted to bury. Mateo caught her gaze, his expression unreadable, but a tiny, imperceptible nod of his chin communicated the cold, ruthless solidarity of two people ready to ignite a wildfire. We have gathered to discuss the immediate termination of the Echoes contract due to gross negligence and ethical violations concerning intellectual property. Richard began, his voice booming with a false sense of righteousness as he gestured to a stack of falsified documents. The evidence is irrefutable. Ms. Vargas has been funneling internal design assets to a private third-party entity for personal gain, a move that severely compromises the integrity of this firm. Elena felt the familiar, suffocating grip of panic tighten in her chest. But before she could rise to defend herself, Mateo stood up, his movements slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. I find it fascinating, Richard, that you possess such detailed knowledge of these supposed internal leaks, especially considering that the audit trail I initiated 3 days ago points directly to a breach originating from your own private server," Mateo said, his voice a low, dangerous purr that cut through the silence of the room. The smug mask on Richard's face shattered, replaced by a sudden, frantic pallor as he stared at the tablet Mateo casually tossed onto the table, its screen displaying a scrolling list of intercepted emails and encrypted financial transactions. "This is preposterous. A desperate, baseless accusation from a CEO who has clearly lost his judgment over a common, manipulative girl." Richard sputtered, his voice rising in panic as the other board members began to murmur, their gazes shifting from him to the damning data displayed on the screen. Elena stepped forward, her hands steady as she retrieved a second file from her bag, her voice cold and resonant as she laid out the final pieces of the puzzle she had spent the night assembling. "The assets you claimed were stolen were actually registered under a shared patent in Madrid 5 years ago, a legal fact that you attempted to erase from the corporate database when you manipulated the acquisition of the rights, Mr. Hayes," she declared, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, burning triumph. The room erupted into a cacophony of shock and indignation, the tide of the board's opinion swinging violently against Richard, his own greed finally catching up with him in a spectacular, undeniable explosion of professional suicide. Mateo leaned back, his eyes fixed on Elena, with an expression of raw, unadulterated awe. She hadn't just been waiting for him to save her, she had been building her own weapon, her own path to justice that left his own corporate assassins utterly redundant. "This meeting is effectively concluded, and security is already waiting outside to escort Mr. Hayes to the federal authorities for his involvement in corporate espionage and industrial fraud," Mateo announced, his voice slicing through the chaos with a finality that made it clear there would be no appeal. Richard tried to scream a final, desperate protest, but he was silenced by 2 security guards who moved with swift, professional detachment, dragging the disgraced executive out of the room as he clawed fruitlessly at the air. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence that felt entirely different from the heavy, suffocating air that had filled the room just moments before. Mateo walked slowly toward her, the predatory, controlled mask of the billionaire CEO completely stripped away, leaving only the man who had been shattered by 5 years of living in a world without her. "You didn't need me to fight for you at all, did you?" he whispered, his voice thick with a strange, complex mixture of pride and profound aching regret as he reached out his hand, hovering inches from her cheek. Elena looked at him, the victory over Richard finally settling into her bones, but the deep, unresolved wounds of the last 5 years still ached with a sharp, insistent intensity. "I needed you to be honest, Mateo, and for once, you were," she said, her voice soft but steady as she finally leaned into his touch, the warmth of his skin sparking a deep, undeniable fire in her heart. He pulled her into his arms, a desperate, crushing embrace that wasn't about performance or ownership, but about the terrifying, fragile reality of a future they had fought with everything they had to reclaim. "I spent 5 years blaming you for leaving, and 5 years hating the world for taking you, when the only person I should have been fighting was myself for being too cowardly to look deeper," he groaned against her hair, his arms a steel cage that she never wanted to escape again. Elena clung to him, the tears she had held back during the entire board meeting finally spilling over, a cathartic release of everything they had both been too proud and too afraid to admit. The game was finally truly over, and the truth they had unearthed wasn't just a victory against the shadows of the past. It was a terrifying, beautiful, blank page that they would now have to write together. Mateo tilted her face up, his jade eyes searching hers with a raw, terrifying hunger, and the kiss that followed was a promise of everything they had lost, everything they were, and everything they would fight to become. The silence inside the sprawling penthouse high above Manhattan was a stark, almost jarring contrast to the explosive corporate warfare they had just survived in the boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, glittering panorama of the city that never slept, casting long, elegant shadows across the minimalist furniture and the two exhausted souls standing in the center of the room. Mateo had discarded his suit jacket somewhere in the hallway, his tie hanging loose, looking less like a ruthless billionaire and more like a man who had just crawled out of a brutal, unforgiving battlefield. Elena stood by the glass, holding a tumbler of amber liquid she hadn't taken a single sip from, her mind still racing to process the monumental shift that had just realigned the entire axis of her universe. The crippling weight of 5 years of resentment had been lifted, but the sudden absence of that familiar anger left her feeling raw, exposed, and deeply vulnerable in the quiet intimacy of his personal sanctuary. I always thought this view would make me feel like I owned the world, but for the last 5 years, it only reminded me of everything I had lost. Mateo murmured, his voice a low, gravelly sound that broke the heavy silence. He walked up behind her, stopping just short of touching her, respecting the invisible boundary that still flickered faintly between them. Elena turned to face him, her dark eyes tracing the harsh lines of his jaw before resting gently on the jagged, faded scar near his temple. That told a story she had been brutally excluded from. Tell me what happened in Madrid, Mateo. Tell me the truth that Richard and your father fought so hard to bury, she requested softly, stepping closer so she could feel the faint, radiating heat of his body. Mateo closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his cheek, as he dragged himself back to the nightmare he had spent years trying to permanently suppress. I was on my way back to our apartment with the ring I bought from that tiny vintage shop near the plaza, the one you stared at for 20 minutes, he confessed, his voice thick with an ancient, agonizing grief. My father's security team intercepted my car, trying to force me onto a private jet back to New York, and when I fought them, the driver lost control and slammed into a concrete barrier. He opened his eyes, the jade depths swirling with a haunted, terrifying darkness that made Elena's breath hitch painfully in her throat. I woke up in a private hospital wing 3 weeks later, half broken, only to find that my father had completely erased you from my life, destroying my phone, my emails, and every single connection I had to Spain. The sheer, monstrous cruelty of his father's actions hit Elena like a physical punch to the gut. The terrifying reality of what Mateo had endured, completely shattering the narrative of abandonment she had clung to for survival. She reached out her trembling fingers, gently tracing the edge of his scar, a physical testament to a love that had almost cost him his life. They told me you had grown bored of your little indie artist experiment and returned to your real life. And I was so blinded by my own broken heart that I believed them, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes as the profound injustice of their stolen years washed over her. Mateo leaned into her touch, turning his face to press a desperate, burning kiss into the palm of her hand. I hired the best investigators money could buy the second I could walk again. But my father had threatened to destroy your career if you ever came near me, effectively turning you into a ghost, he rasped, his hands coming up to grip her waist as if he were terrified she might evaporate into thin air. The control, the obsession, the ruthless way I operate. It was all a desperate, pathetic attempt to ensure that I would never be helpless enough to let someone tear my life apart again. Understanding flooded Elena's soul, replacing the last stubborn shards of defensive pride with a fierce, overwhelming surge of protective love for the man who had fought a silent, invisible war for her. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into a tight, grounding embrace, refusing to let the ghosts of their past dictate another second of their future. You are not helpless anymore, Mateo, and you don't need to lock me in a glass cage to keep me safe, because I am choosing to stand right here, she declared, her voice ringing with a clear, unshakable certainty that finally banished the shadows from his eyes. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling her familiar, intoxicating scent, like a drowning man taking his first, agonizing breath of air. After a long, suspended moment, he slowly pulled away, walking over to his desk and picking up a sleek black folder that he extended toward her with a trembling hand. These are the revised contracts for Echoes, drawn up while you were fighting for your life in that boardroom, he said, his voice stripped of all corporate authority, leaving only naked, terrifying vulnerability. Full creative control, absolute financial backing, and zero reporting obligations to me or Sterling Media. You are completely free, Elena, and you can walk out that door right now to build your empire, and I will never stand in your way. Elena took the heavy folder, staring down at the legal documents that represented everything she had fought for, the absolute freedom she had fiercely guarded for 5 long years. She looked from the papers to the man standing before her, the billionaire, who was voluntarily stripping away his own armor, offering her the ultimate choice, even if it meant breaking his own heart again. With a slow, deliberate movement, she gripped the thick stack of papers and ripped them cleanly in half, letting the shredded pieces flutter harmlessly to the expensive Persian rug. I spent 5 years building a fortress to keep the world out, Mateo. But a fortress is just another word for a prison if you are entirely alone inside it, she stated, stepping over the ruined contract to close the distance between them, her eyes blazing with a passionate, undeniable fire. I don't want a project without you. I don't want a victory without you. And I certainly don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had just been brave enough to stay. The shock on his face instantly melted into a look of pure, transcendent reverence as he pulled her flush against his chest, his mouth crashing down onto hers in a kiss that tasted of absolute salvation and a profound, infinite homecoming. The frantic, desperate edge that had defined their previous encounters was completely gone, replaced by a deep, slow, and consuming heat that promised a lifetime of exploration. He swept her off her feet, carrying her toward the massive bedroom as if she weighed absolutely nothing, his lips never leaving hers, savoring the sweet, intoxicating reality of their reunion. Later, as they lay tangled together in the tangled silk sheets, the city lights painting a soft golden glow across their bare skin, Mateo traced mindless, comforting patterns along her spine. I suppose this means we will need to negotiate a new set of terms for our partnership, Ms. Vargas, he murmured playfully, his voice a low, satisfied rumble against her collarbone. Only one clause matters now, Mr. Sterling, Elena replied, shifting to rest her chin on his chest, her dark eyes meeting his with a bright, unshadowed happiness. No more secrets, no more shadows, and absolutely no running away when the board inevitably tries to interfere with my creative genius. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that echoed through the quiet penthouse, sealing their new agreement with a tender, lingering kiss. The echoes of their painful past in Madrid had finally faded into silence, leaving them to write a beautiful, unwritten future in the heart of New York.